Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Norton. I'm the Assessment and Development Coordinator in the Dean's Office of the University Libraries and a member of the Planning Committee for Campus Conversations in Standish. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for our first installment in the spring series. Launched in 2015, the Campus Conversations program aims to promote faculty research to the University at Albany community and beyond. The university libraries are proud to offer a venue that allows for a give and take of ideas and perspectives. The success of this series would not be possible without the long-standing support of the University Libraries Administration or the hard work of the Campus Conversations Planning Committee, Camille Chesley, Irina Holden, Jane Kessler, and Mark Wolf. I extend my gratitude to them, as well as to all of you who have tuned in for making this afternoon's webinar such the occasion. As we gather, Eastern Europe teeters on the brink of war. Ukrainian officials accuse separatist forces in Donetsk and Luhansk of repeated shellings resulting in casualties. The UN Secretary General characterizes Russian aggression as an attempt to, quote, rewrite the entire global security architecture. All the while, Russia is evacuating her embassy in Kiev, one of the clearer signs that an invasion may be imminent. It's a hectic, confusing, and dangerous time. So, to make sense of some of it, we turn to an expert, Professor of History, Dr. Nazyezhda Kizenko. Professor Kizenko is a scholar of Russian intellectual and cultural history. Her most recent book, Good for the Souls, A History of Confession in the Russian Empire, was published by Oxford University Press last year. She teaches courses on the history of Russia and the history of Eastern Europe at the undergraduate level, as well as in modern Russian and Soviet history at the graduate level. In 2015, Professor Kizenko received the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Award for Outstanding Achievement in Teaching. She holds an AB from Harvard University and a Ph.D. from Columbia University. It's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Professor Kizenko.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And when Tyler asked me to do this and we set a date a few weeks ago, I thought to myself, February 23rd, that's interesting because exactly 105 years ago today was the beginning of the February Revolution in the Russian Empire that caused Nicholas II to abdicate, and that would mean the end of the Russian Empire as we know it. But who knew that the last few days would be so packed? It was almost impossible to write this talk in advance. As we all know, on Monday, President's Day, in an alternative reality man in the high castle speech, Putin recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, note my air quotes, violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, preparations for this began over the weekend when Russia commenced mass evacuations of the citizens of the DNR and the LNR, the so-called republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, mostly women and children. At the same time, military authorities of the two self-proclaimed entities began a forced mobilization of the male residents. Now, Putin has a certain logic that was used in the Crimea based on the presumption of sovereign decisions through simulated democratic free will. So in other words, because these areas voted for separation on May the 11th, 2014, Putin's logic is, well, that's what the people here wanted. I am only supporting this decision. Again, this is the ostensible logic that he is using. Now, why these areas and why did he do it? Because rather than a full-scale invasion into Ukraine, which Putin, alas, could have pulled off, he settled for the formalization of control over territory that was already controlled by Russia. The Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic that you see on the screen in front of you are already essentially under Russian control. But Putin decided not to back down and to actually push further and to say, I'm not just recognizing the two republics on the screen in front of you, but in fact also on the two oblasts overall, the Luhansk Oblast here and the Donetsk Oblast here, and the oblasts are actually still in control of Ukraine, while these two regions are under control of Russian behalf separatists. Now, why are fans of Ukraine, and I count myself as one of them, why are fans of Ukraine not necessarily getting freaked out over this and see it in a strange sort of way, almost perhaps even as good news? In what possible scenario can one put a positive spin on this? Well, for starters, this means that for Russia, sanctions are on. Russia's ruble, bonds, equities, and the economy in general will soon be headed into negative territory. Only on Tuesday, yesterday, the Russian ruble was officially declared the most volatile currency in the world. The effect from the sanctions will be the same as if Putin had, in fact, invaded full scale, but with one hopes that there will be less Ukrainian lives lost. Any shelling from now Russia-occupied territory will be Russia's direct responsibility. With the more bullets that are fired, sanctions will go up and up. Russia will now have to spend billions to demine and clean up the territories which will revert to Ukraine in the future. And Ukraine can and should use this as a pretext to clean up its own house, getting rid of corruption and ineptitude. I have actually a more optimistic prediction at the end, but I will save that for the end, as maybe we'll get more breaking news in the next half hour. Still, some things are not going to change, and those are the things that I am going to talk about. Because I am not a military expert, I'm not a political expert, I'm not the political or military counselor to any of the presidents involved. I'm a historian here at Albany. And what I can say is that whatever happens in Ukraine in the next few days, in the next few weeks, and in the next few months, Ukraine isn't going anywhere. Neither is Russia. Even if they vanish from the front pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Ukraine and Russia will remain important foreign policy concerns for North America and Europe alike. We need to get used to that. And to get used to Ukraine and Russia as permanent presences on our horizon, I think we need to have a better grip on not only the events of the past 4 days or the past 4 weeks or the past 4 years, but we also need to have a better grip on the key past moments in the Ukraine-Russia relationship. After all, if one were trying to understand the United States, yes, the 2020 election would be useful. Yes, the 2016 election would be useful, but one would also kind of have to know something about the Civil War or the New Deal or the Declaration of Independence. So what I would like to talk to you about today are the key benchmarks, the core myths that were here before Putin and Zelensky, and they will be here. These benchmarks, these myths will be here after Putin and Zelensky. And the people who believe these myths in both Ukraine and Russia will be with us as well. Because we can't appreciate just what profound a change Putin has made in Ukraine itself and in Ukraine's relationship with the rest of Europe and with North America if we don't know where things stood before February 2014 or before February 1991 or February 1917, or for that matter, before that. Because then we will know what the triggers are on both sides, where the red flags literally are on both sides, and hopefully avoid waving them. So let's start from the beginning. Why in his address in front of his Security Council on Monday, and in a longer speech that he gave last summer in 2021. Why does Putin talk as if Ukraine and Russia are one country? Why does Putin act as if Ukraine and Russia are one country? Why does Putin sound like Michael Corleone in that scene from The Godfather Part 2, where Kay tells him that she is leaving and taking the children? The answer is because at one point back in the day, just before the year 1000, the image that you see on the screen in front of you, the ancestors of present day Russia and Ukraine and Belarus were one country. Present day Ukraine and present day Russia and present day Belarus all come from 9th century Viking traders and raiders, first sailing through these areas and then settling down and intermarrying. So all of them can claim the heritage of Old Rus. Not one of these three states, not Russia, not Ukraine, not Belarus, can claim to be the true successor state. All of them can legitimately claim this space as their ancestor and this heritage. At around the year 932, the first image on the screen when we started, there was no Russia, there was no Ukraine, there was no Belarus, there was only Rus. And culturally, legitimately, it belongs to all of them. The same with the medieval Franks of Charlemagne's time, who were neither French nor German. The same with everyone who came out of the Holy Roman Empire or Austria-Hungary. But the first key moment in Rus identity, the first key moment in the identity of Rus, both as a part of Europe and opposed to the rest of Europe, is the moment at around 988 when great holy Prince Volodymyr Uladzimir of Kiev accepted baptism into Christianity for himself and for his nation, with his grandmother Olga, who you see on the screen in front of you, having converted to Christianity earlier. By the way, it's funny to note that Putin and Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and for that matter, Lenin, all owe their first names to him. But why? You might say, why do I say Rus as opposed to Europe? Wasn't Christianization the moment when Rus became more like its neighbors, when Rus became part of Christendom? After all, it's not only Volodymyr of Rus who is converting to Christianity in the decades just before 1000. It's also Mieszko of Poland, Stephen of Hungary, Harold Bluetooth of Norway, Olaf of Sweden, the whole second wave of European Christian conversion. So why don't we question these areas as being part of European Christendom the way people sometimes do with Rus? The answer, of course, is that yes, the rulers of these lands may think that they are becoming just Christians, but in fact, it's more complicated than that, because some of them are becoming Christian baptized by Latin-speaking priests from Rome, or they are becoming Christian baptized by Greek-speaking priests from Constantinople. At the moment when everyone is converting in the last decades of the 10th century, they may think that they are joining Christian civilization, but they are, which is not false, but they are joining a Christian civilization which is about to become fractured and break communion. Now, all of this will take centuries to realize because bishops can excommunicate whomever they want, but importantly, kings and queens still feel themselves to be part of a common Christian network. Rus is part of this common Christian network. We're not yet, if we ever were, in the Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations. Rus was part of the all-important European royal marriage network. Yaroslav the Wise of Rus, who married Ingigerd, Olaf's daughter of the King of Sweden, had several daughters who intermarried with foreign princes, some of whom came to live with him. A fresco in St. Sophia's Cathedral in Kiev shows these daughters. Elisiv married Harold of Norway. Anastasia married the future Andrew I of Hungary. Anne of Kiev married Henry I of France. Agatha became wife of Edward the Exile, the royal family of England, who became, all of whom came to Kiev after losing the famous Battle of Hastings. Rus was, in this stage, a normal European Christian country, but as the centuries went by, in fact, as we will see, the fragmentation as a result of the invasions of Mongols to the east would be part of why it was Orthodox Christianity that allowed these areas, whether they were paying tribute to Mongols as the ancestors of present-day Russians were, whether they were under the Poles or the Lithuanians as the ancestors of today's Ukrainians and Belarusians were. It is the Orthodox faith that allowed themselves to maintain a sense of identity vis-a-vis the people to whom they were now paying taxes, whether Poles or Lithuanians, or in fact, the nomads who would become the rulers, well, if not the rulers, at least to the tax collectors of the Rus to the east. And it is at this point, after the nomadic invasions, that the overall experiences and identities of present-day Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians start to go in very different directions. The ancestors of the present-day Russians managed to shake off the paying taxes to the Mongols a little bit over 100 years, whereas the ancestors of the present-day Ukrainians and Belarusians find themselves in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where they are third-class citizens. So the ancestors of the present-day Ukrainians and Belarusians start to define themselves first and foremost against the Roman Catholic Poles, but also against the Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And let us not forget that the Jews are now, that in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Jews are the largest Jewish population in Europe. And in fact, it is precisely because of their third-class status. And let us actually look for a moment at this map to see how fragmented in terms of present-day national identities, where the ancestors of present-day Belarusians and Ukrainians were located in 1619. It is part of this being split among different nations, among different rulers for such a long time during their formation, that it is all the more impressive that the national identities of present-day Ukrainians and present-day Belarusians are in fact so fixed. And they actually they acquired more of a sense of their identity in around the year 1648, as you can see on this map, the very large Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when just as Europe is emerging from the Peace of Westphalia, the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians now have new self-proclaimed defenders in the persons of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Why do the Zaporozhian Cossacks present themselves as the defenders of Ukrainian and Orthodox Christian identity? Because This group, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, had emerged from the East Slavic population living freely in the southern steppes of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They had also served the Poles as a military bulwark against Ottoman incursions and Christian raids. But over the years, the Cossacks also decided, for a combination of reasons, that they would defend the interests of the Orthodox Christian population of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, who are the enemies of Bogdan Khmelnytsky? On the one hand, they are first and foremost the Polish Catholic rulers. They also include the Jews, and in fact, it is no accident that the Jewish population of this area still remembers Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the same kind of language that they use for the evil Haman. But also, Khmelnytsky and the Cossacks are also fighting those Ukrainian Christians who in 1596 decided to accept the leadership of the Pope of Rome and became known as Uniates, or those who accepted union with Rome, or the name that it is proper to call them, Greek Catholic Ukrainian Christians. Greek, not because they're Greek, but Greek Catholic because they are not Latin Catholic. Now, things get tricky when the Cossack uprising ultimately starts to go very badly for the Cossacks, and Khmelnytsky turns to the Orthodox Muscovite Tsar for protection. What exactly does that mean, to ask for protection? Historians are still arguing about that. It is true, the Cossacks did take a loyalty oath in 1654, but it is not clear what precisely they thought their obligations would be going forward, or what the Tsar of Muscovy thought his obligations were going forward. What is clear is that many Orthodox Christians in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, especially Ukrainian Orthodox Christian clerics, did genuinely, at this stage, I stress, at this stage, they did genuinely think of Orthodox Muscovy, of the Russian Tsar, as being their new best friend. It is Ukrainian Orthodox clerics, not Russian ones who came up with the idea of the fraternal peoples. Many Orthodox Christians at this stage were genuinely glad to be in an empire ruled by fellow Orthodox Christians. Why? Because from their point of view, it beat being a third-class subject of Poland. In fact, the most loyal subjects of the Russian emperor, paradoxically, as this might seem, became those Orthodox Christians who lived on the edges of the Russian Empire and who knew precisely what it was like to be kicked around by people of other languages and religions. Paradoxically, the far-right political organization, the Union of the Russian People, was especially strong in the Western Ukrainian borderlands of Volyn. But not every Ukrainian Orthodox person was happy by any means, and especially not every Ukrainian Orthodox Cossack. Because another big turning point for Russia and Ukraine, vis-a-vis one another and vis-a-vis the rest of Europe, and especially vis-a-vis Poland and Sweden, came during the Great Northern War. What happens during the Great Northern War? The Great Northern War is Peter I, later known by some as the Great of Russia, leading a coalition led by Charles XII of Sweden. So essentially, Russia is making its bid for the Baltic Sea, controlled largely by Sweden. And one crucial moment came in the Battle of Poltava, which you can see on the screen in front of you down on the bottom. One crucial moment came during the Battle of Poltava in 1709. To get to Poltava, which is in Ukraine, Charles XII of Sweden had to go through Poland. And Charles XII, crucially, was helped by the Ukrainian Cossack leader, Ivan Mazepa, who switched sides from Peter of Russia and is now fighting on the side of the Swedes. This is a crucial moment because it shows that some Ukrainian Cossacks, some Ukrainians, even if they are of the same religion as the Tsar of Russia, now see the Tsar of Russia as a threat to their independence. But because of a combination of the freak cold winter, Russian scorched earth tactics, Charles was crushingly defeated by a larger Russian force at the Battle of Poltava. Charles of Sweden, Mazepa, and Orlik and other Ukrainian Cossacks flee to the Ottoman Empire, where the rest of the army, while the rest of the army surrendered. Now, this battle and this war became a permanent European turning point. Sweden would never be a first-rate European military power again. Russia became the new dominant power in the Baltic region and a new major force in Northern European politics. Here is a tapestry of Peter showing him at the victory for Russia of Poltava, also indicating how Russia is also presenting itself after the Battle of Poltava as a European power. But this map shows you what Europe looks like after the Great Northern War. Russia now has the so-called Baltic provinces, or Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, present-day Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been under the control of Sweden. And some Ukrainians, after the Great Northern War, are now in the Russian Empire. Some are in Poland, some are in Hungary, some are Orthodox, some are Greek Catholic. Eventually, Catherine II, known by some as the Great, comes to power in Russia. From the point of view of Western Europe, Catherine is glamorous and enlightened and an art collector who corresponds with everyone who is anyone. George Washington, Voltaire, the Brothers Grimm. If there's one thing that Catherine knows how to do, it is PR. But from the point of view of other parts of Europe, Catherine is actually kind of death. On Catherine's watch, Poland is partitioned 3 times. You can see on the screen in front of you how various parts of what had been the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are partitioned among 3 nations: Russia and Prussia and the Habsburg Empire. My point being that it's not as if Russia is the only bad guy here. Many great powers are only too happy to take the slices of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that are closest to them and most attractive to them. So during the partitions of Poland, Catherine acquires the Ukrainian lands that Poland had kept after its wars with Khmelnytsky. And just as Catherine meant the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Catherine also meant the end of the independence of the Cossacks. Catherine forced the last Cossack hetman to resign. Catherine erased the last vestiges of Cossack autonomy. A city that used to be named for her, Yekaterina Slav, or Catherine's Glory, which you see as the red dot on the map in front of you, became the administrative center of so-called New Russia, the lands conquered by Count Gregory Potemkin, including Crimea. Interesting sidebar, the city formerly known as Yekaterina Slav renamed Dnipropetrovsk in 1926, renamed Dnipro relatively recently, became a key center of the nuclear industry, the arms industry, and the space industry of the Soviet Union. By the way, it's extremely telling and worrying that in his speech on Monday, Putin evoked this new Russian idea. He evoked what happened in Odessa in 2014. Putin's words were, quote, Ukrainian towns have been swept by a wave of pogroms and attacks, a series of flagrant and unpunished killings. By the way, one has to say here that Putin constantly mentions the fact that Russian speakers in Ukraine are under threat, are under attack. That is absolutely not true. I mean, just period, full stop. Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, speakers of no language in Ukrainian held lands in Ukraine are under attack. The Russian speakers in Russian held areas are facing military action by Russians, but that is a different matter. In any case, Putin mentioned the fact that there were some Russian supporting protesters in Odessa who were killed in 2014. He used the words, the criminals who did this were never found and never punished, but we know them by name and we will do all that we can to find them and to bring them to justice. So the message was, even if you are in Odessa, we know who you are and we are coming for you. This does not bode well for the Black Sea coast, so we need to keep our eyes peeled on that. But back to the early 19th century. Catherine does eventually die, and the age of modern nationalism arrives. The ideas of the German Romantic philosophers that every nation has its own spirit, the American and French revolutions, all of this encourages some 19th century Ukrainian intellectuals to see sovereignty now as something vested in the people, represented above all by the peasants. The Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, who was born a serf, embodied this aspiration. So Ukrainian intellectuals, instead of seeking the return of Cossack autonomy, instead develop a new notion of Ukraine as a territory in which linguistic and ethnic criteria identify the majority of the population as Ukrainian. Not religion, but linguistic. This is very important. This is especially the case for those Ukrainians who were not in the Russian Empire and had never been in the Russian Empire. Because again, after the partitions of Poland, some Ukrainians remained in the Habsburg Empire, or were now in the Habsburg Empire from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Many of which includes above all Lviv in present-day Ukraine. Many of the Ukrainians in this area were not Orthodox Christian, but were Greek Catholic. And incidentally, this area was also the area which was the home of the founder of Hasidic Judaism, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. The city of Uman in Ukraine is the center of the annual pilgrimage of tens of thousands of Breslauer Hasidim. Because although people might sometimes call themselves Russian Jews, most Jews who lived on the territory of the former Russian Empire or on the territory of the former Soviet Union, in fact, lived in the so-called Pale of Settlement, or the lands that are present-day Ukraine and Belarus. But the Greek Catholics, the Ukrainians in this area, had absolutely no reason to feel nostalgic toward Russia or to want to be a part of Russia. They didn't speak Russian. They spoke Ukrainian. They were not Orthodox Christian. They were Greek Catholic. And if anything, as the years went by, they had ever more reason to be hostile to Russia and to the Russian imperial project. First, Catherine tried to force Greek Catholics to convert to Orthodox Christianity. Nicholas I in 1839 tried to compel Greek Catholics to convert to Orthodox Christianity because Nicholas and the Russian Orthodox Church in general saw Ukrainian nationalists in Galicia as being disloyal tools of the Catholic Poles and the Catholic Austrians. And the problem is, this is not entirely false, because the Austrians did use the Galicians as a way of fomenting Ukrainian national feeling against the Russian Empire. Unfortunately, the Russians fought this in really ham-fisted ways, like banning the Ukrainian language and everything except works of literature. And what the impact of the Russian imperial policies is to make Ukrainian activists in whatever empire they were to try to find common ground. For starters, they start to call themselves Ukrainians instead of any of the names derived from the word Rus that could result in their being mistaken for Russians. They turn to wearing the embroidered Ukrainian shirt known as the vyshyvanka as a patriotic indicator. They start to collect local stories for the local geographic societies. But all of these national and religious tensions would become truly epic at the end of the Great War. By February 1917, exactly 105 years ago, the war was going so badly for the Russian Empire. There were so many bread shortages that the people of Petrograd took to the streets. Nicholas abdicated. The provisional government started stumbling and fumbling, and the soldiers started deserting in droves. In October of 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd and Moscow, but much of the former empire opposed them. So a volunteer army quickly assembled to fight the Reds. And now things become extremely complicated in both Russia and Ukraine, because for some regions like Finland or Poland, this was now easy. They had wanted independence from the Russian Empire. They fought for independence from the Russian Empire, and they got independence from the Russian Empire. But what would the Russians and the Ukrainians do? The problem is there was no monolithic Russian consensus about what to do next, and there was no monolithic Ukrainian consensus about what to do next. Some Russians were communist, many more were not. What about all of the anti-communist Russians? Some wanted to bring back the Tsar, some wanted a republic, some wanted a democracy. There was no single Russian side, nor was there a single Ukrainian side. Some Ukrainians wanted a restoration of the Russian Empire, whether liberal or monarchist, with Ukraine as a part of it. Many Ukrainians did not want this. They did not want communism, but they did want independence from Russia, the so-called Ukrainian People's Republic led by Semyon Petliura. And as in Russia, there were some pro-Bolshevik forces also in Ukraine who wanted communist for everyone. So some Ukrainians in Ukraine are fighting for an independent Ukraine. Some are fighting on the side of the whites. Some are fighting with the Bolsheviks. But the Bolsheviks, of course, don't want a Russian empire. They don't want a free Russia. They certainly don't want a free Ukraine. They want communism for everyone, which means that they also want to take Ukraine and Poland. So 1918, as this map shows, with everyone fighting over Ukraine, was a very messy year because, of course, the Poles do succeed in beating the Reds, but part of the Ukrainians end up in the new post-war Poland. Part of the Ukrainians end up in what is now the Ukrainian SSR. And the Ukrainians that are in post-war Poland deeply resent that they did not succeed in winning independence. They deeply resent being treated like second-class citizens by the Poles, who also try to stamp out Ukrainian nationalism. So Ukraine and Poland both become ticking time bombs. Poland is independent, but again, it has a large Jewish and Ukrainian population, and the Ukrainian population in Poland is increasingly alienated. In the Soviet Union, Ukrainians now start to encounter the dreadful trauma of being between both Hitler and Stalin. The 12 awful years between 1932 and 1945, when these regions are, when both Adolf Hitler are in power, are dreadful years for the people like the Ukrainians who are unfortunate enough to be caught between both Hitler and Stalin. By the time the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, millions of people have already died. They have already died at the hands of the Soviet regime. During the first 5-year plan, millions of peasants all over the Soviet Union lost their farm, their livelihoods, and their lives. The major grain-producing parts of the Soviet Union, which includes Soviet Ukraine, first and foremost, were hit with a man-made famine. The Holodomor, death by hunger. Even though there was enough food, because of Stalin's policies, millions of people in the regions that you see on the screen in front of you, which includes present-day Ukraine, which includes the region of Kuban in present-day Russia, starved to death. So when the Nazis occupied Poland in early September 1939, this was an opportunity for Ukrainian nationalists in Poland, just as the Nazis proved to be golden opportunities for all sorts of nations in Europe who felt that they had gotten a raw deal after the First World War. This includes Ukrainian nationalists, this includes Hungarians, this includes Croatians. All sorts of nations in Europe took Nazi occupation, took Nazi invasion as an opportunity to settle scores and to create their own nations. So the Ukrainian nationalists in Poland, now that Poland was again partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Ukrainian nationalists tried to proclaim an independent Ukrainian state, which also unfortunately meant anti-Jewish pogroms in Lviv, and eventually, unfortunately, meant genocidal ethnic cleansing against both Poles and Jews by Ukrainians. As in 19, the communists remained the only group who would consistently defend the Jews. Now, why is this important? Because after the Second World War, there were two Ukrainian narratives of what had happened in World War II. The Soviet narrative, the Ukrainian Soviet narrative, stressed Ukraine's role in the Soviet Union's collective struggle against fascism. And the Soviet narrative portrayed the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army exclusively as Nazi collaborators. Whereas the nationalistic Ukrainian narrative emphasized the anti-Soviet, anti-communist struggle of the Ukrainian insurgent army that lasted until the 1950s. These are very different narratives reflecting very different experiences, but they all have elements of truth. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, did fight for an independent Ukraine, and they did fight against communism. Parts of Ukrainians, parts of Ukraine and Ukrainians did also fight on the side of the Soviet Union against the Nazis. But Ukrainian identity remained strongest in the westernmost regions of Ukraine, which had never been part of the Russian Empire, and which had had only a brief and extremely unpleasant experience of Soviet communism. So, but ironically, the result of the Second World War was to make Ukraine a unified entity for the first time, which is to say Ukraine, including Western Ukraine, and 1954, the peninsula of Crimea was also gifted by Khrushchev to Ukraine. But in any case, to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the signing of the agreement between Khmelnytsky and the Tsar of Russia. So ironically, the result of the Second World War was that Poland was almost completely ethnically cleansed. Poland ended up almost completely homogeneous, whereas Ukrainian society ended up being extremely diverse in its languages, with Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, and in religious structures as well. But then the moment, sort of a moment of reckoning, came after 1991. Germany, after having gotten beat in the war and putting Nazis on trial, made a clear decision that it has stuck with: zero tolerance for Nazis, zero tolerance for Nazism, commemoration and reparation to groups and individuals the Nazis killed. It was much more complicated in both Russia and Ukraine with the legacy of communism. Again, relatively easy for the Poles. Communism was bad, end of story. But for the Russians and Ukrainians, the legacy of communism was complicated because part of the success of the communist narrative was, well, didn't we beat Hitler? Can't we feel good about having beaten Stalin? Way too many Russians and Ukrainians were part of the communist machine to point the finger at so-called collaborators. So there were competing narratives. But after 1991, it's actually extremely interesting to see what happened. Ukraine declared independence, as the image on the screen in front of you says, and in fact, just about every former republic of the Soviet Union declared independence. And yet there was no Yugoslav-style meltdown after Soviet collapse, in part because Russian President Boris Yeltsin initially positioned his newly independent Russia as the opposite of the oppressive Soviet regime. So it was possible at that moment for Ukrainians to think, okay, Russia is also becoming democratic. We can give up our nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum of 1914, in which three nuclear powers, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and the integrity of its borders. A great deal has happened since 1991. The most crucially, Ukraine has evolved into a genuinely diverse, a genuinely democratic country. And Ukraine, especially, whatever language one spoke in Ukraine, Ukrainians did not want a duplication of the direction in which Russia was going, which is to say, in an increasingly undemocratic, increasingly autocratic direction. The Orange Revolution of 2004, the Maidan Revolution of in 2014. What these revolutions were about was wanting to reclaim, wanting to claim, wanting to maintain the real political diversity that Ukraine had actually had ever since the Cossacks, tradition of popular election. By the way, one might also note that this has its bad sides in the sense that Ukraine has not elected a single president twice. Their tendency is to elect someone new. But the interesting thing is that the more ham-fisted, the more aggressive that Russia has been, especially in the guise of Putin's claiming to defend Russia, what this is doing is actually making the Ukrainians more and more united as a country. If it was possible in 2010, if one were to look at an election map of Ukraine in 2010, one would see clear divisions between Eastern and Western Ukraine. What I find incredibly interesting is that it is after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, it is after every increasingly aggressive move that Russia makes, even the Russian speakers in Ukraine, anyone who might have had any nostalgia, any warm fraternal feeling dating back for centuries, that is all being eroded thanks in large measure to Vladimir Putin. So even though, as I have tried to show here, even though there is a tradition of some sense of mutual good feeling on the part of Russia and Ukraine, that it is because of the actions of Vladimir Putin that, ironically, what Putin has had the effect of doing is frittering away the whatever sense of commonality, whatever sense of a willingness to work together that had been built up over centuries. And ironically, by acquiring Crimea, which actually did have a very large Russian-speaking population, and actually which might have been genuinely inclined towards being a part of Russia. The point, however, is simply that the people who are in Ukraine now have a far stronger sense of Ukrainian identity, perhaps, than they historically ever have. And Putin may well go down in history as being the ruler who is the Napoleon of the 21st century in increasing the strength of national feeling among the areas that he tried to conquer. So we can only wish Ukraine the best in trying to struggle and maintain the sovereignty that it has won. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kizenko. And if we have some time, if folks want to put in some questions, Mark will be taking the lead on those.
I have one ready to go if you're interested. The professor talk about why Putin blames previous Soviet leaders like Lenin and Khrushchev for creating what he considers, the problem of Ukraine right now.
Because under the Soviet Union, I mean, you're absolutely right. Putin did allude to the mistakes of Lenin and federalism in his speech. That in Ukraine in the 1920s, in particular, there were very strong Ukrainian language policies, and in fact, there was this idea that the republics should have identities distinct from Russia. So that in fact, during the Soviet Union, one did have to know the national languages of these areas. You needed to be able to pass language exams in Ukrainian in Ukraine. You had to pass Belarusian language exams in Belarus. So that what Putin is criticizing the Soviets for is being far too tolerant of diversity, far too promoting, at least giving lip service to the idea of diversity. I'm not saying, by the way, in no way am I saying that the Soviet Union was a paradise for people of nationalities, but at the very least, they at least paid lip service to the idea that it was the Ukrainian Republic, the Belarusian Republic. They were not called Russian.
Thank you. That was from an attendee.
Okay.
I might ask another question. This is my own. And I tried to do a little research on this and didn't get very far, but the term Finlandization of Ukraine has been talked about as a possible way forward, not a fun way, but a workable way. What do you think of that? And can you briefly explain it? Because I'm not very good at it.
Well, I mean that the Finnish model is actually something that is trotted out from time to time. The idea being that Finland does not push for being a part of NATO. The idea being that Finland understands realistically what its possibilities are and somehow sort of accepts for a while that it's going to be in the Russian sphere of interest and does everything that it can to avoid provoking the Russians. In other words, Finland tries not to, quote unquote, kid itself about what it could realistically expect. Now, that said, although that might have been a viable model and was a viable model for Finland at various earlier points, it's worth noting that today Finland itself has called for the possibility of NATO membership for Ukraine. So Finland itself doesn't see Finlandization as a model for Ukraine going forward. And also, one might also point out that 2021 is not 1921, and it's also not 1951. So one can't go back to what Finland was at that point and say this applies to Ukraine now. Also, one might point out, Finland is located in a different place than Ukraine is. Finland is not at the center of Europe the way that Ukraine is. So obviously everyone's geopolitical calculations are going to be quite different because they are quite different.
Thank you for that. That helps a lot. I'm going to let Tyler take over there's a couple questions in the Q&A box.
A few in the chat. So first, Professor Zahavi would like to know, can the US threaten direct involvement, including the renuclearization of Ukraine, based on the Russian betrayal of the Budapest Memorandum from 1994?
Yes, that actually would be absolutely legitimate. Only I would add to that not only a betrayal of the Budapest Memorandum, but also the Russians have basically turned their backs on the Minsk agreement that they had with Ukraine itself. So Ukraine need not feel bound any longer by the Minsk agreements. And the United States, I mean, that essentially, if one side of the agreement breaks the agreement, why should the other side feel constrained to stick to it? I mean, I'm not saying that I think that this would be a good idea necessarily. That's a different matter. But I'm saying that it could be absolutely legitimately claimed. Yes.
All right, we have a question about media representation on the conflict and the notion that we shouldn't care about the conflict, and how might this affect the United States if a future president, perhaps a Republican, is not going to focus so intently on the crisis?
I mean, I don't want to sound like the comedians from the 1970s and 1980s who would say things like, you don't want to go into Ukraine, Ukraine will come to you. I mean, that in other words, the United States and Europe, they don't have the luxury of pretending that this doesn't exist and that this isn't in their interest. Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. I mean, let us not forget this. And it's very telling, for example, that Germany has, shut down the pipeline Nord Stream 2, that it's really a question of what kind of international order does the United States want? I mean, of course, there's always been a group of people in the United States who are isolationist and would like not to get involved and to not have this go away. But then the United States, I mean, and now I'm not speaking from the point of view of Ukraine or from the point of view of Russia, but from the point of view of the United States. The United States doesn't have the luxury of saying, we're just going to let Russia deal with it and not get involved. I mean, it's there are too many geopolitical interests at stake. It would be unrealistic to do this.
Thank you. I've got a question in chat. Maybe we'll do that one, Tyler.
Some historiographic questions now. So now we're really getting into it.
Getting serious now. This is the question. I know you don't represent yourself as a policy expert, but are you familiar with? Okay, yeah, all right. You identify that. Okay, but are you familiar with John Mearsheimer's thesis on how Ukraine is West's fault? And this is since 2013, 2014. The question is where are the worst historical blind spots in the current debate on today's military crisis? Blind spots, I guess.
On whose side? Like on the part of the Americans, on the part of the Russians?
Melissa's Timothy Sergey asking, Western commentators side, US side.
The reason that this is a hard question for me to answer is that what Putin blames Western Europe and what Putin blames the United States in particular for is not entirely false, which is to say that the United States did support the Orange Revolution. The United States, I mean, we can say that it's American NGOs and so on, but there's no question that the United States supports those tendencies in Ukraine that Putin does not like. I would say the blind spots on the part of the US, if anything, and again, I'm not an expert and I'm not presenting myself as such, that one can actually call them missed opportunities in not having an accurate enough reading of what the population of Ukraine actually wants. Because the funny thing is that before the annexation of Crimea, like in the same way that you would hear people in the United States saying what's wrong with Kansas, or having people in red states or in blue states like jokingly, only not entirely jokingly, say if only we could just split off those people from the United States. So there actually were people in Ukraine who thought that for Ukraine to be more Ukrainian, they would be better off without Crimea and without the people in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. I mean, I heard Ukrainian nationalists themselves say this, and there was no general consensus for NATO. That after 2014, what has happened is that they're now actually, with every action that Putin takes, this is actually driving the Ukrainian population to genuinely want NATO first and foremost. The United States, could certainly provide more weapons than it has. They could certainly apply harsher sanctions than they have. But I would say that probably what the United States is trying to avoid And what, more importantly, what President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine is trying to avoid is not actually ratcheting up the war rhetoric in an attempt to try to diffuse the situation peacefully. Because in fact, what Putin is trying to do, it seems to me, is to try to provoke escalation and to try to provoke reactions. And what Volodymyr Zelensky is trying very hard to do is to keep this from happening. So I think the United States has to tread a very fine line, because on the one hand, reaction has to be, somehow firm. And at the same time, one doesn't want to give Putin the opportunity to say, aha, look, they actually are being the aggressor, because so far it's not possible to say that.
Thank you for that. Tyler, do you want to do another?
Do you have time for a few more questions? I don't want to.
I think we can go until 1:45.
All right, so we'll do some of these rapid fire.
Okay.
Do you feel that Putin's historical claims are unique, or is he continuing a historical tradition?
Oh, the claims aren't, they aren't unique at all. I think actually the big mistake that Putin is making is that he genuinely thinks, and this became clear on Monday, it became clear in the speech that he gave in July of last year, he genuinely thinks that people in Ukraine actually really want to be Russian and feel themselves to be a part of Russia. And that if we just send in the troops, they will be welcomed as liberators. Okay, he really thinks this. He really thinks that Ukrainian national feeling is an artificial construct that is whipped up by the United States or whipped up by diaspora groups from Western Ukraine. And I think that essentially what Putin doesn't realize, and what a longer Russian historiography doesn't realize, is that a sense of Ukrainian separateness, you can place it in the 1330s, you can place it in the 1600s, you can place it in the 1900s, but there's no question that there has been a strong sense of separate Ukrainian national identity for centuries. So Putin is not new from this point of view, not at all.
All right, we got a question from Professor Irwin on the lessons and misuses of history. Is the Munich appeasement analogy useful, or do you think it's harmful?
Many people on social media have been trotting this out, have been trotting out this very example and is saying, okay, this is exactly how this corresponds. Hitler didn't recognize the Czechs as being as being a separate people, as being a real people, and so on and so forth. I mean, in a way, we will only know if it's a helpful image a month later. I know that during the Sochi Olympics, there were plenty of people who said, "Oh, the Sochi Olympics, we need to look back to the 1936 Olympics happened in." And sure enough, after the Sochi Olympics, in Crimea. Personally, will start throwing around Hitler, right? Because as soon as you start attributing, motives to any side and bringing up that specter, inflammatory. I think it's useful, and is an excellent example in the example of appeasement, of what can happen if one doesn't act quickly enough. I think actually that one thing that what the Biden illustration is doing very, very well is to not making claims that it's not prepared to back up. I think it's actually very good and very useful that anything that the United States has said so far hasn't been bluster, hasn't been showboating. So it has a sense of reality. So I think it actually more useful to think about how can the United States concretely help Ukraine, but in a way that it's actually prepared to do. So I know that there are many people who are frustrated at what seem to be mild sanctions now, but they actually are happening. And I think that if the United States sticks to a policy of delivering on what it says that it's going to do, then it actually will be very clear. And sticking to the line that it has maintained so far, that I actually think is the sanest course for all concerned.
Great, thank you. That covers, we had a question about sanctions and that really
Okay.
covered it too. All right, and so if we're gonna wrap things up, you said you had a optimistic view of how events might play out.
Yes.
That you were saving for
Yes.
the end. What is?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that my optimistic thing is that actually I think that Ukraine will come out of this fine. This actually, like from what I see from my friends in Ukraine, from what I see in my friends in Russia, this is actually much more destabilizing to Russia and to Russians' image of themselves than it is to Ukrainians and Ukrainians' image of themselves. It's not exactly an optimistic scenario, maybe more of a pipe dream, but it would actually make me very happy if Russia took another look at the 1990s and resumed a course of democratization from which it was derailed, and that in fact Russia and Ukraine, this is admittedly a very optimistic scenario, post-Putin and post what Putin represents could in fact be ironically fraternal, or okay, maybe fraternal is a bad word, but friendly nations in a way that friendly democratic nations in a way that Putin will have made possible, assuming something really bad doesn't happen first.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Kizenko.
Okay.
We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We are recording this and we'll upload it onto YouTube. So if anybody had to leave early, or could forward it to any folks that you might find useful to. Thank you.